Well, I wanted to say that in order to write my last book, Humming the Blues, I had to learn to decode Sumerian pictographs that were pressed into clay by a woman named Enheduanna over 4,000 years ago. I needed to do that before I could do a jazz poetry interpretation of her lines in praise of the god Inanna. And as you can imagine, it took me a long time. So when I decided that I wanted to write another book, I wanted to do something really fast. I came on the idea that what I was going to do was a quick and dirty murder mystery, which my cousin the sheriff will understand. So I already had a detective character, an FBI agent who had tired of routine crime and decided to move to art to clear his brain and his soul. And that's the character that I took along with me the first time that I visited Granada and the Alhambra, and the first time that I met the Ring of Lions. We also there met a fictional scholar who's the director of the Alhambra, the castle of the last Moorish king, and as her assistant as well, a young postdoc from Cuba who believes that he's the descendant of Columbus's Jewish interpreter, an historical figure, by the way, who traveled with Columbus on his first voyage. And there's one other character I want to tell you about, a young woman who comes quietly into the story carrying the shadow plot. She's a folklorist from New York with ancestral ties to the man from Madrid. He's a mathematician and an astronomer who gave Spain an Arabic collection of the letters of the medieval Muslim Neoplatonists. And in these letters are the animal folk tales. We won't meet her tonight because I've constructed a short trailer of sorts so that I could squeeze 300 pages into about 11 minutes. So here we go. The trailer begins, can you hear me well enough? Yeah? Okay. The trailer begins in chapter 1. Graciela Corsal de Moreno came down a wide stone staircase and stepped out onto the plaza. She was in her 50s, close to the age of La Reina Isabella when she died. But it was not the 16th century, and Graciela Corsal de Moreno did not appear to be aging. Her gait was quick and strong, and her scholarly mind was the same. If you didn't know you were supposed to call her Doctora, you would have found another title, maybe Doña. She was the kind of person who entered your thoughts and remained there. She took the narrow path to the old castles and reached the courtyard of the lions, an open square surrounded by slender pillars that appeared to be made of fine bone china, stretching from the marble floors to their own lacy concrete shoulders. Water channels ran from 4 sides of the courtyard and met in a circle at the feet of 12 lions. Doctora Corsal's visit was in honor of those beasts, who were assembled in a circle surrounded by walls full of poetry written in flowing Arabic script. She approached the ring of lions, and she appeared to be promising the animals that she would be successful. She was carrying a proposal that the Alhambra be added to the list of the wonders of the world. For her, it was the duty of the director of the Alhambra to carry this Moorish city in all its magnificence on her shoulders. Of course, her memory also supported images of tolerance being extinguished, of Spain's monarchs expelling the Jewish and Moorish populations, of blood spattering on the sand of the Inquisition, and the land being thinned by civil war. But the vision Doctora Corsal held close was of the time in Spain when one language touched on the boundaries of another without leaving a gap, when mathematics, architecture, astronomy, and poetry linked scholars as if they were triangles joined to squares on the walls of the Alhambra. When she first learned that biological deterioration had been detected in the Alhambra, she refused to admit that it worried her, but just in case, she sent one of the 12 lions, the one she called El Noveno, to an atelier in Paris to be cleaned. But when lion number 9 came back, it was suddenly performing water magic again for the first time in 5.5 centuries. Before Isabel and Fernando had taken over in 1492, the fountain had surged water to the mouth of a different lion each hour, working like a clock, until Isabella ordered her workmen to take the fountain apart. And no one had been able to repair the lions since then. Some Spaniards believed Isabella had been frightened by the control the emirs seemed to have over water. Did she imagine they were exercising magical powers, transmuting matter, practicing alchemy? And now El Noveno was suddenly spouting water every evening at precisely 9 o'clock, performing in the exact fashion it had worked for the emirs, and Doctora Corsal was anxious. Why had no one been able to fix the fountain before? Had her lion been stolen, and a forgery with a cutting-edge timepiece been returned to the Alhambra in its place? She couldn't voice that concern in curatorial circles. The mere suggestion that she was anxious about the authenticity of El Noveno would lead to rumors about one of the most highly regarded and controversial of the Alhambra's treasures. At this point in the novel, Graciela Corsal decides to find an expert, an art detective, somebody who can be trusted. She meets Walter Drummond, an authority on precious antiquities, and invites him to Granada. It was forgery that had started Drummond on the road to connoisseurship years before when he was a young postal inspector. He loved the quiet precision that enveloped him when he was alone with documents. Why he'd left that job, he was never sure. How had he let himself be lured away by the FBI? Perhaps it was the enticing notion of doing good for society rather than spending his days alone at a desk. But in the end, he'd spent nearly a decade with a holster over his shoulder, seeking perpetrators of distasteful crimes. He was a valuable person for the Bureau because he could recognize patterns in the actions of a guilty party, patterns that he defined as aesthetically attractive. He was relied upon for the fresh eye he brought to the circumstances of wrongdoing. He focused on criminal skill, but he kept a safe observational distance, exactly what a good investigator should do. He wasn't showy. For him, solving a case was a dexterity that could be taught to young agents, until he learned that maintaining observational distance was difficult to teach. His young assistants were entangling themselves with suspects, and Drummond was having trouble extricating them. His team was watching his fascination with the aesthetics of violence, financial, psychological, and physical. And it had become hard for Drummond himself to balance on the thin edge of transgression. It was time to distance himself, to go off on his own, back to documents, back to artifacts. After he left the FBI, he had calls from the Getty and the National Gallery and the Louvre and the Prado. He established a reputation as someone who could be trusted to make his visits seem routine and keep his findings off the record until and unless a curator decided public disclosure was necessary. We leave Walter Drummond making his way up to the Alhambra to meet Graciela Corsal and her assistant, Ruben Torres, a postdoc from Cuba, perhaps the descendant of Luis de Torres, a Jewish translator and a historical figure who became Columbus's interpreter and stayed in the Americas after Columbus returned to Spain. And now Ruben, where is he? Not there in the office where Graciela expected to find him. He left the office to meet with one of the artesanos, a Basque apprentice named Ander, who was working on a project at the Alcazaba. Ander had promised to take Ruben to see an opening in the hill, a tunnel into the Alhambra. Perhaps the cave where the princesses hid after riding horseback all night, or maybe it's where the emir escaped when the Catholic kings were going to kill him. But they didn't kill him, Ander. Ruben had replied. He rode out on horseback through the gate of justice in plain sight. He already had surrendered. They let him go. Because they didn't think he had anything left to give them. The people say he slipped out earlier to hide his treasures. Ruben wanted to know more about the tunnels into the Alhambra, and Ander insisted you could hear the stories if you leaned into the hill. But whose rumors are they? Ruben asked. They belong to the people, Ander said. I hear them every day at work, in the plaza. Everyone knows these stories. He was sure that he'd found a soft spot in the hill. More than a soft spot, an opening. But there'd been too much talk lately. His supervisor threatened to cut the workers' pay if the storytelling didn't stop. Someone wants to keep us quiet, Ander said. Can you show me that spot? Ruben asked. And that's when they had agreed to meet on Thursday afternoon at the edge of the Darro, directly below the Torre de las Armas. Ruben was crouching down to tie his boot when he slipped sideways into the soft earth on the bank of the Darro. It was a mixture of loam and pine needles, a dark mud created by a short burst of rain. His shoes were covered in it, more than his shoes, his stockings and his trouser legs and his hands. He supposed his face was smeared with the stuff as well. He'd been waiting for his friend, but Ander hadn't appeared. Ruben waited longer, another half hour before giving up and scaling his way back and forth on his own in search of a secret entrance. The hill was steep. He had to hold on to a poplar branch to pull himself to the small plateau about halfway up the hill. And when he moved a branch out of his way, he saw a shoe dangling about 20 meters away. He worked his way up until he could see the shoe had a leg attached to it, and the leg was attached to a young man's body. Ander was lying in the brush at the edge of this strange plateau, his legs twisted in an alarming way. Ruben crawled over to Ander, who seemed to be staring at him. He touched his cheek. His face was cold despite the heat. His neck was twisted oddly, and the side of his head was covered in dried blood. Ruben leaned over, putting his ear on Ander's chest. There was no movement, no sound. Ruben leaned back against the hill and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. His first instinct was to call Ander's family, but they were somewhere in Basque country. He didn't know them. He didn't even know where Ander was living in Granada. So he phoned the policia and reported that he had found the body of a young man on the hill above the Darro, just below the Torre de las Armas. See, he told the policia, yes, of course. He would stay there, on the hill. He would wait for them to arrive.
Thank you for that, Cass. I read Ring of Lions probably about 9 months ago or so, and hearing that trailer brought it all back to me, and it's a good feeling. And hearing it again, hearing your reading made me change my plan for my questions for you. Instead of the question I was planning on starting with, you commented that you intended writing Ring of Lions to be a break or something different from the book that had preceded it, and that you had decided to write a mystery. But I wonder if at that time you conjured up this world, or if there were seeds of either the history or the place or the characters germinating inside you before that, maybe long before that.
I think they were there before that, maybe not the seeds of this story, but something. Because I was a undergrad Spanish major, at St. Catherine's, and my professor and my advisor had said to us on the first day and every day thereafter, whoever hasn't seen Granada has not seen anything. But he said in Spanish, que no ha visto Granada, no ha visto nada. And that stuck in my head. And he also said, you must never enter Spain from anywhere except from Gibraltar. And so waiting for that opportunity took many years to, was kind of, but we decided one time to go to Spain. And because we couldn't go through the straits, we flew it to Gibraltar. And that in itself was a big surprise. It's like walking the plank, the whole airport. Because I looked out, it was a small plane, and I looked out to my right, and there was the sea, and I looked out to my left, and there was the sea. And we just landed. So yeah, the whole notion that that one had to go to Spain and one had to do it right was there somewhere in my mind. Certainly not the whole world of the book, because many of those things came to me that I met the lions, and then I began to meet other features.
So when this book acquired a lot of readers, do you think readers might be able to go to the Alhambra and visit, besides the lions, visit places, visit sites? You know, this is where this happened in the story, this is where that happened?
I think they could, yeah. I definitely think they could. And Natasha, my daughter, was here, has a plan for taking tourists.
Okay, that was not a planted question.
Is there a sign-up list?
Okay, well, then let's move to the question that I had planned to begin with,
Okay.
which is, if you could tell us the course of your writing career and the twists and turns it has taken over time.
It has taken a few twists and turns, but writing has always been there. I was at St. Catherine's when the journalism major opened at St. Thomas, and at that time, it was a time when there was no associated colleges of the Twin Cities. They were just all separate entities. But St. Thomas decided to make a partnership just with St. Catherine's, department by department. And if you go back and look at those long ago dates in the literature of St. Thomas, you will find a piece that was written when they opened the journalism department to students who were not from St. Thomas, and the headline was, "This year we are going to allow non-males in the journalism department." So that may be the beginning not only of this novel, but of my search for the earliest of women writers as well. A lot of work that I've done over the years. But so I started, I edited the college newspaper, and it's, the rigorous way that everybody does it. And then I worked for a weekly newspaper. In between there, we were in the Peace Corps in Columbia. So I wasn't writing then. But when I came back, I had jobs writing, doing public relations, all that sort of thing. And then decided I wanted to go into television. I worked for KSTP as an on-air reporter in the 70s. And at that point, I covered politics and crime and the intersection of those two things. And then, where am I in this whole long thing? Oh, then I went back, I did an MFA after that, because I wanted to get to honest writing, after doing TV news. But I discovered that all writing is good and honest, it can be. But, So I did a stint in the 70s as an on-the-air reporter at KSTP, and then did freelance work again, and went back to school and got a PhD, and somewhere in there started teaching writing at Augsburg and never left. Yeah. Yeah.
If any of you would like to see what Cass was like on camera with KSTP, I believe there are clips on YouTube that you can find, and if not there, I saw it a long time ago. The Minnesota Historical Society has a KSTP news video collection, and surely there
I heard about that. They have KSTP has donated
yes.
their
Yeah.
video. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, to write Ring of Lions, you had to not just do the work that all fiction writers do, understanding characters and developing the plot, but you also had to digest a lot of historical information about the place and the history of the place. How did you do that, and how did you meld that kind of research with the story that you were creating?
I didn't do it quick and dirty.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, I ended up taking about 10, 15 years to write a novel. At the same time, I was designing and directing the MFA program at Augsburg, so I wasn't there 8 hours a day working on it, of course. But little by little, I would have to say, and it did kind of come to me in different pieces. I didn't have all the pieces at the beginning. I like to write in a way that I feel like I have an implied author sort of between me and my keyboard, and I don't necessarily always know where I'm going when I start. So over the years, that same thing is true, kind of a bigger platform, but I would find something and I would get curious, and then I would look it up, and then so in all, I would find things, I'd write, I'd get curious, I'd find something else. When I found Luis de Torres, who is an historical character, I thought this character is too good not to do something with him. And then I began to think about, okay, how does he come into this? And also, this is a story basically not just about murder, but about friendship. And I do a lot of mythology, and there is a story about the ring dove, which is a folk tale, and it's translated from the Sanskrit, from the Panchatrata, and I was very much excited about that, and then I began to read about other things. I mean, it's like, okay, one day I discovered, there was a group of Muslim Neoplatonists who were fascinated with folk tales and the animal stories as well as others, and that just took me. And so then my character, my young folklorist from New York, comes into the storyline, and I had decided that I wanted people who could be of romantic interest to one another. So we have the young ones, and we have Graciela, and we have Drummond, who are the elders in the story. And then I really was enjoying the dynamic of those people crossing the age group.
It sounds like a layering kind
It was
of approach.
definitely a layer.
So does that mean that the novel that we have here to read is much different from what you originally started working on?
I started working on a novel, a mystery, that would involve this strange thing that happened when Isabella ordered the lions taken apart.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was going to be there, and that's sort of the core, essential part of the story. Why were they taken apart? Why were they saved? Why was this fountain, which seems to have been, may have been first in the home, almost a castle itself, of one of the lieutenants of an earlier emir, who was a Jewish lieutenant and a Secretary of State kind of person. And because there is such a strong resemblance between this and Solomon's fountain, and so there's questions about what is this fountain and why animals in the midst of a culture that is very careful not to use animal figures. So these things all were there, but I had to let my mind be satisfied with how they came together.
And another aspect of it must have been that you wanted to build suspense. How all writers, in fiction or nonfiction, want to build suspense in the sense that we want our readers to feel an impulse to keep going.
Yeah.
How did you handle that, and how did you make that happen?
Well, suspense in itself is, some of my poor former writing students say, we already heard that lecture, we don't want to hear it. But suspense happens when something is suspended. So you don't get suspense if you're just constantly telling people, here's a riddle and here's the answer, and here's a riddle and here's the answer. You raise an issue and you suspend the readers and the characters' resolution of that, and that keeps people turned in.
It sounds like that is another way of saying you raise a question and then you let the reader look forward to it being answered, anticipate it being answered, and maybe come up with his or her own possible answers.
Yes, and maybe even having conflicting answers and opportunities, because that's what the irony of fiction is all about, isn't it? You can have several different things being true at the same time. You can have truths grinding on each other like the tectonics of the earth. Yeah.
You mentioned right now about fictional truths made me think of something that we have discussed before. For some years, I was part of the faculty, the MFA faculty at Augsburg. Cass brought me in, and we had an incident in which a writer who's mainly a memoirist came to talk to students, and she disclosed that in one of her pieces, she had invented a scene, completely invented it. And I taught nonfiction students, and I was aghast. But often when I hear of memoirists and other nonfiction writers talking about doing things like that, inventing scenes or inventing dialogue or changing chronology, they often talk about a poetic truth or artistic truth and poetic truth. Do you have thoughts about that, and whether you approach truth differently in fiction than in nonfiction and other kinds of writing?
I think I remember that afternoon that you're talking about, and both of us had been journalists, and we were in shock, and no one else was in shock. And as we sort of created a bond between the two of us at that moment. But I think what I would just say about what the people, the memoirs, that one particular writer in particular are doing is what I do as a historical fiction writer. That's the business of fiction. And Toni Morrison calls it literary archaeology. You sort of go into the archaeology of a moment. You may have all of these, and this reminds me of your work, you may have all of these files and all of this information, and in the case of your new book, all the medicine. But if you're a fiction writer, I think you are totally free to excavate that archaeology, to try and find out what isn't in the database, and what might have happened, and what could happen. Yeah.
Filling in the gaps.
Filling in the gaps, looking back at Devaney Lozer, who wrote a very wonderful, much appreciated by me, forward to this book, mentions Jane Porter, who wrote what she says is the first historical fiction in the world, or at least in the English-speaking library, when she was doing the story of William Wallace and in Scottish Chiefs, and wrote this in the early 1800s, and allowed herself to decide to go inside William Wallace's brain to try and see what he was thinking, and to get in touch with his grief about his wife being murdered and his vengeance. And that made her work historical fiction rather than just pure history. And I think I would like to think that I'm doing that same sort of thing.
And is that a different process in your mind than writing fiction that's not historical?
I don't seem to be able to get away from history, Jack. I did the history of women writers is my novel Nin, and I just have this. I have a hard time letting it go. In fact, I think I find out about my characters by sort of dipping them in history and seeing how they react to that situation, that moment.
So they're guinea pigs.
Definitely are guinea pigs. They are definitely guinea pigs. I am a guinea pig when I sit down to start a novel. I don't necessarily know.
And when you started Ring of Lions, and since that time, it's because you include some characters who are historical figures and some who aren't. Do you feel the same way about them? For instance, do you feel perhaps possessive of the completely fictional characters in a way that the historical figures that you bring to life, you perhaps don't feel possessive of? I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
I think I'm a little possessive of La Reina Isabella as well as the others. I think I'm so happy that I met Luis de Torres. I would never be happy to run into Torquemada on the street. But he's something that is a wonderful character. That the High Inquisitor was Isabella's advisor and confessor as well. So things crossed over there back and forth. I'm even possessive of lions.
But not the whole castle.
Maybe the whole castle. Maybe the whole castle. It's an amazing place.
Which makes me think if next time you visit the Alhambra, do you think you will experience it differently because you have written this book?
I think we experienced it. We went in 2006, we went in 2010, we went in 2014, we went in 2007. We went 4 different trips. And the Alhambra looks different at different times. And when we realized that, after that, we started, getting tickets to go in at night as well as in the day. I think things are slightly different because modernism has brought in electric light and things like that. So I don't know if it will look exactly the same the next time I go back or not. Yeah.
It makes me wonder that I've heard a lot of fiction writing students talk about how they may feel confident about developing a plot, or they may feel confident about building characters, but often setting is difficult, and to make the setting come alive in the same way that characters do. How do you think you did that? And does using a historical place as your setting help? Because there's so much there, and it goes so far back.
Well, it's good to have that. I mean, it's really good to have something that just can take you back, just sink you back. But I think my way of writing has a lot to do with using my five senses. And so I like to take notes when I'm thinking of a place, when I think I'm in a place where I might want to use the scene, I take heavy notes. And then sometimes I just take notes on places just because I'm there. And I have a pen and a pencil, or I walk along the creek and talk into my phone.
People think you're having a phone call.
But the thing about that is then you've got the real details, and it really, I don't think I can just sit in a room and conjure up a setting. But if I can see something, it doesn't really matter if I saw the light going through the leaf in Minneapolis or in Granada. I can use it in either place, but I had to see the light in the leaf. And so I think of those as exquisite accidents when you find those, so I get them down on paper.
So you would recommend that writers or writing students carry notebooks and paper and pens with them?
Which so many writers don't always have.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you have notebooks going back a long way?
I do. I haven't going back, but I'm sort of a hybrid typing kind of writer and handwriting kind of writer that they're kind of confused.
So you have two places where you can go,
Yeah,
or keep
many
things.
places. Many places.
Now that Ring of Lions is out for people to read, what do you think is next for you? Where are your interests taking you and your writing impulses?
Once again, I found myself saying what I said when I finished Humming the Blues, which is, I'm a woman of a certain age, and I've only got so many 15-year fiction projects. So the question then is, what do I want to do? And I've been working on poetry. And a poem you can finish. And so I've been working on doing that. I have been encouraged by Gary Lindbergh, my editor from Calumet, when he found out that I have a complete novel that I wrote on in Underwood in 1982. He convinced me to have it digitized, so I've gotten that far. But that's a possibility. In the back of my mind, before I knew it was going to take me so long to do this, I thought, well, I think Drummond is somebody who might want to move on to another place, investigate another thing. So I'm in a quandary about it.
So a series is possible, or at least a second book.
Maybe a second book.
Okay.
Maybe
Um,
a series.
How does it make you feel when you look at that old typewritten manuscript that you wrote 40 whatever years ago? How does that make you feel about what's there on the paper, and also about the you who was the writer?
Yeah, and that's a good question. Yeah, and Deb Jones, who's in the audience, asked me that question not long ago. Is that where you are now as a writer? And the answer to that question is I don't know. I have to get further into looking at that. And then I have to try to figure out, this is a story about the news business, and there's no film, there's no video. I mean, the world is totally different.
Another historical novel.
Yeah, definitely does. It would have to be historical. Yeah, but I did truly enjoy going back in history, in journalism history, to thank you and good night last. Yeah. Oh, good night and good luck. I'm sorry. Good night and good luck. Last week when it was on TV from Broadway, fantastic. And so maybe people are interested in the journalism of that backward time.
I think they would be, or some would be. And with Ring of Lions, is there anything in particular that you hope or expect readers to take out of it?
Yes,
What
but
is it?
I don't think I can tell them right now.
You'll just all have to read it.
There's
and-
definitely something at the core of the story that I
Yeah.
hope people will take away. And maybe I can say this without ruining the novel, but I think it's the notion of tessellation, which is the idea of what happens when you have tile that come together and never overlap but touch in a way that never ends. The touching never ends. But the tile keeps its own space, keeps its own position, but it's all together in the walls of the Alhambra. You just look around, you can see it. Yeah.
Mm.
And that can happen with thought and people.
Maybe another way of getting at that is, I once gave a book reading, and at the end, someone in the back stood up and asked, why did you write this book? And so I had reasons why I wrote the book. It had to do with the subject, important subject, too few people knew about it, blah, blah, blah. And she interrupted me and she said, that's not what I meant. I meant, why did you have to be the person to write this book? What would be your answer to that demanding question?
I have a very complicated sense of Spain in this story, and what it means. And at one point I was going to put a line from a different medieval poet writing either in Arabic or in Hebrew at the top of every chapter. I thought, no, this is getting a little too much. Slow it down. But I think that I have things that come from my study of mythology and from my study of Spanish and just my fascination with the Arab architecture and the language and that had to come together to make this story work. And that's what I have, and I did it. I don't. Maybe somebody else could do better. I don't know, but it's what I had at my hands, you know, and pulled it together.
It seems clear to me that nobody else could have done it at all. I mean, that it is the way it is because of you and everything that you brought to it, which I always think about when at the end of the year we have our best books of the year lists, which to me is a foolhardy exercise because one book, the book crowned Best Book of the Year, was written the way it was because the author was the way that he or she is, and somebody else couldn't have written it that way and would have written it differently, maybe better, maybe not, but that they're their own entities, and they are their own entities because the authors are their own entities, and they couldn't have come from anybody else.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask something about you.
Can I say no?
When I was reading Face in the Mirror, which is your latest, it's just out,
Mm-hmm.
which is about the first face implant that Mayo Clinic has ever done. I realized when I was about halfway, 3/4 of the way through, that I was panting while I was reading. I mean, talk about suspense and that was it going to work? Was it going to live? Was the doctor going to be successful? And I realized that I think that you write nonfiction medical thrillers. They're not just nonfiction works, they're thrillers. And I had that same feeling. I remember when I first read The Lobotomist, saying to myself, what am I doing here? I'm enjoying reading about the creation of lobotomies.
A guilty pleasure.
Definitely a guilty pleasure. And then the Nazi and the psychiatrist.
Mhm.
That is so amazing. And the Nazi and the psychiatrist, can I just summarize it a little bit and you can correct me? But it's about the army doctor, Douglas Kelly, who is assigned to be the psychiatrist to Goering, right?
And the other top
And
Nazi
the other
leaders
top
who were held
Nazi leaders who
for
were
war
being
crimes.
tried in
Yeah.
Nuremberg during this time.
Mhm.
And so that was his job, and that's where he had to be, and he had to be inside those minds. And then he had to go on and live after. And you managed to get his private papers, his public papers, his work papers from there, and his papers from his family, and put it all together. Can you talk a little bit about the extensive process that you go through when you do this?
So my process is a little bit like yours in some ways, because yes, I have masses of information that I've gathered through research, and part of my job I don't consider myself a historian, even though I write only or mainly about history. I'm just someone who writes about history. And part of my job is to develop characters out of that mass without fictionalizing and inventing. And so I do a lot of thinking about what's motivating this person. And if I conclude that X is motivating the person, then it's because I've found it in the material and have drawn it out. Now, in the case of Face in the Mirror, about the face transplant at Mayo Clinic, I realized early on that this book was about three different things. One is the path of the patient, a man named Andy Sandness, and he needed a face transplant because he attempted to kill himself and shot himself in the face. And then another part of the story is about his relationship with his surgeon, Dr. Samir Mardini, and how they developed a close bond. Dr. Mardini cared for Andy for, he still does, so now it's close to 20 years that he's been Andy's doctor. And then the third part of the story had to do with the operation and what went into it and how it was prepared for and all of that. And I knew just instinctively that the operation itself was the heart of the story. regardless of all that, I also wanted to get in there about the characters. And so I broke the operation into halves. The first half was mainly about it was a 56-hour operation over a long weekend. And so the first part was mainly about removing the face from the donor, who was brain dead, of course. And then the second part was about planting that face on Andy. And so I used everything I could from Andy's medical record to draw that out of, and which was a formidable task because the medical record was 80,000 pages. Covered a lot of years, and also his procedures, Andy's procedures were very extensive. So I thought consciously about the place of the operation in the book and how I wanted it to move, be understandable. A lot of it was very technical, and to show it through the eyes of the participants. Andy, of course, was unconscious, but Dr. Mardini, and there were 60 other people on the staff who were there in the operating suite doing various things. So I captured that through the medical record and through interviews with people who were there. It took a long time. How long? I started the book in 2019 and just came out last month. Maybe this would be a good time for us to take questions from.
One other thing I want to ask. The Nazi and the Psychiatrist has been made into a movie.
Yes.
And it's going to be called Nuremberg.
Right.
And when are we going to be able to?
That's why I asked you the question about feeling possessive, because so my book has been adapted into another medium. The movie's done. It has been done for quite a while, and the producers are still setting up distribution, and there are 2 studios, American studios, vying for U.S. distribution. So if one Studio A gets it, then it'll come out at the end of this year. If Studio B gets it, it will come out next year sometime. But I have seen scenes from it, some just on the screen, some I saw being shot. I was present for part of the shooting in Budapest, and it's really good. And I don't feel all that possessive about it, and the story in the movie takes some different pathways than my book does. The movie is not 100% factual or even close to that, but that's fine. That's somebody else's interpretation. I had my chance with the story. I'm happy to let someone else have a chance, but look for it. In the future, it stars Russell Crowe and Rami Malek as the Nazi and the psychiatrist.
So Russell Crowe is...
Goering, yes. Yeah. The psychiatrist, Douglas Kelly. Freddie Mercury, was he a bad guy? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, okay, questions from all of you?
So I find this discussion really fascinating and deep because it gets into the ethics of writing, and how each writer has to sort of draw her own ethical line. And you were talking, both of you, earlier about you were appalled as journalists when memoirists made up events for artistic reasons. I remember way back in the early 70s when E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime was written, which was a wonderful success, that certain critics thought it was terrible because he was putting words in historical figures' mouths that weren't said and imagining scenes that they could not have been part of. And of course, by now, we have fiction all the time that's using actual historical figures and turning them into fictional characters. Would you find it in your work a line had been crossed if, for a historical novel's purpose, that you changed history somewhat to fit your needs for suspense. Are there any lines that you wouldn't cross? Or, in other words, would you say, I cannot alter this date, even though it would serve my narrative, or I cannot put this thought in this character's head, because there's no way this character could have thought that in that year? But, or does that line not matter? Because you're after a larger artistic purpose. I don't know if this question is making sense, but I'm really interested in this ethiks.
Are you asking
It's to
a
both of
fiction
you.
writer to respond or a non-fiction?
We'll start with the fiction writer and then go to the historian.
I don't think there's any limit on what you have to do in a novel. A novel is a novel, except for the fact that a novel must do something novel. There must be some grain of something that your reader is learning that's new to them. It gives them a chance to see something new. In one of the scenes that I sometimes worried about was the scene in when Ruben is imagining the experience of the man he calls his grandfather, although it's so many generations back, it's not his grandfather. He imagines how Luis de Torres might have lived in those last years before he went to America with Columbus. And that is me doing that literary archaeology and letting myself go down and look at it. I think that's fine. If I said this is a nonfiction work, I would be breaking all my rules. But this is fiction, and that's what fiction is for. You should be able to imagine things that didn't happen, as well as things that happened. Now, if you're talking about, can you change a date if the date isn't right and it doesn't work? Well, the whole question is, does it work in the fiction? Have you set it up so that when you mention that date as the date that you want to change it to, it works? It works in the fiction. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that a character could have a reason to get the date wrong, or could be going back, or you just have to make sure as a writer that you've made it make sense, that it works, that it holds true, that the character that you've changed holds true, or becomes such a different character that you've reimagined the character, and you've got a new character who just has a resemblance to this other person, and that if it works, but I did have a problem that afternoon with the writer saying she thought she needed to juice it up a bit, so she invented some Italian canoes. And it added but maybe you should say something
About her?
No.
I have a lot to say about her, but I think in nonfiction, things, what you write should be factual. But there are a couple of areas where there are, in my mind, strange boundaries. One is in the voice that I use to tell the story. It can be a narrow slice of me, of the real me. It can be more jocular than I am, or it can be very sober telling of the story, more sober than I am. So I would use a voice that just serves the story best. And then the other gray area comes in, if I've got a medical record of 80,000 pages to work with, I can't include all of that in the book, obviously, and wouldn't want to. So I choose what goes in. I choose what factual material I use. And that's where the story comes from. A nonfiction narrative, anyway, is not just a collection of things that happened one after another. It's a selection of what happened to tell a story that is factual. So those two areas, it doesn't make the book fictitious, but it makes the book personal.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier at the beginning of your presentation, suspense and suspension and things that's suspended and so on. And I think a lot of readers assume when they pick up a suspense novel that it's all about who killed so and so or something. Who is the perpetrator of the crime, whatever the crime might be. And I have a good friend who writes mystery novels. He always puts the crime right at the beginning so you know what happened and who did it. And takes that element out. And yet there's plenty of suspense. And I've been criticized by friends at times for talking about the way my novels end because I don't care if people know. What's really important is, well, I'd like to find out what you think is really important in terms of what is the real suspense? Is it just figuring out who perpetrated the crime? Or is there other stuff going on in your character that provides a lot of suspense and is every bit as important, if not more important, than who perpetrated the crime and why? Do you take us on a kind of inner voyage, or is it just flying out?
I believe I take you on a number of voyages because we have Ana Madrizón, the folklorist, who's connected to the Muslim background of the Alhambra, and you have Ben Torres, who's connected to the Jewish translator, who was in 1492. And these two young people seem to me to be on a sort of a reverse diaspora, going back to the place that their families left because they wonder. They have some things that they need to know and that they're wondering, and so we've got that going on. We've got a detective who obviously is detecting, and you've got Graciela who is really carrying, in her mind, carrying the Alhambra on her shoulders. So she has things that might have to do with carrying the history of Spain, and carrying the impressions of Spain, and wanting it to be one of the wonders of the world. That she sees it as a wonder, and so she's carrying wondering, and so all those things are happening. And then in the middle of all that, there are some other characters who carry their own thoughts about the history of Spain into the story, and they come together, and then we get a couple of deaths that fall right into it. I don't know if I answered you right.
Cass, I've never been to the Alhambra, but I'm guessing as a historical site, there's some sort of gift shop at the end when you're exiting. And I'm wondering if you've thought about placing your book there. Just
Actually, I have. There's an organization in Granada called Granada Secreta, and they do a lot of things. And the director of that whole program is also a writing teacher, and I've written and talked with him over the years. And I'm trying to figure out how to best get him a copy of it. But he's been helpful to me right down to the proofreading stage when I was trying to figure out why I hadn't put an accent over Luis. And I wrote to him and said, what's going on here? There should be an accent over Luis, and I'm not finding it for this character. It's because Luis for Luis de Toros is one syllable, and so the Spanish rule didn't take effect, and so but he was willing to write back to me and tell me that in the middle of proofreading, when I all of a sudden realized I was worried that I had missed an accent mark. So yeah, there's people there that I would love to get back in contact with. Thank you, that's a good idea. We'll have to tell the people from Calumet. We need to the publisher should establish a liaison. Oh, Professor Young.
This is an infinitely rich subject, this question of the relationship between fact and fiction. And the things you've said are very, very interesting. I guess there is such a thing as fake fiction, just as there's fake news and others. Let's put that aside. Two very practical questions. I think you've answered the first. Have you had any Spanish readers of the novel yet?
Yes. Oh, well, yes. I've had, and George Rabassa, who's one of the people who blurbed it. He's not Spanish, he's Mexican. Becky Bowling, the poet, is American, but she's a lifetime scholar of Spanish literature, and she read it in several iterations early on and later, and then
Well, I wish there was many enthusiastic Spanish readers as English readers. My second question is this: if I understood you, Cass, you said the project, one of the original questions you asked yourself was, why did Queen Isabella dismantle the lands? Have you answered your own question, or are you still thinking about it?
I tend to agree with the Spaniards that I referred to, who thought that maybe she was nervous because she thought there was some magic being done. Can I tell them how our first conversation, Gary, my editor, he was unsure what was going on there. We got halfway through our conversation, wasn't sure why the Queen of Spain would be upset about alchemy, which should be science. And at that moment, I knew something about Gary, and I said, Gary, you were not raised Catholic. Because if you were, you understand fear of alcohol. And so I tend to believe that, the Inquisition, which no one expects, not was all a part of her life story and her father. Yeah, I think she also undid the water wheel in Portland. She thought she didn't want them having.
We probably have time for one more question.
Can I ask a less cerebral one?
There we go.
Yeah. So I'm always wanting to know, do you have a favorite sentence, a part of a character that is just really precious to you as the person who created these characters and these scenes for us? You have a part that resonates with you so much that it's just a very personal part of you, or a personal part. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Like, okay, like that part that is your heart in this book.
I think I have to, I can tell you a scene
Yeah, that's great.
that's very much that. And I loved writing it, and I loved reading it, and I loved maybe doing it myself. There is the scene where Drummond and Rubin are going around the fountain, looking into the eyes of the lights. And that scene with all of the beautiful lacy work, the walls, writing on the walls, I really love it. So then I think, okay, also onomatopoeia, they have folklore. And maybe the two of them together make it's really exciting.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that's maybe a more personal
Yeah.
question, but it gives a book life.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
art.
Can I tell Jack who your employer is?
Yeah. You can.
This is a writer who works for the mail for me.
I've heard of your work.
So you know what that's like.
Yeah.
Any other anything?
I've just got to say, I have to ask you, why do you think, don't mind me, the memoirs are anything but fiction? I mean, come on.
Wow.
But that's okay, if I think what you need to do is let the reader know that that's what you think.
But anytime you're writing the story of your life,
It's fiction.
it's going to be fiction, in a sense, because you don't remember it right.
It's going to be a curated part of your life.
Yeah.
But there's certain memoirists that I believe their work is factual, and it rings factual to me.
Oh.
One is Susan Cheever, if you've ever read her book Home Before Dark, about her relationship with her father.
And really, I didn't mean this to be a serious,
Yeah.
heavy, just a little lightness there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming out.